The cameras were rolling. The studio lights burned hot. Millions were watching. Subscribe so you never miss moments when ordinary voices redefine power. Share because silence helps the arrogant, but speaking amplifies truth. Comment, tell the world what courage and integrity mean to you and why standing up matters. Alan Dershowitz leaned forward in his chair. The corners of his mouth curled into a smirk that only decades of courtroom victories and television appearances could perfect. His voice cut through the broadcast with the ease of a man who had dominated debates for half a century. "Congresswoman," he said, pausing just long enough for the silence to bite, "you clearly don't understand constitutional law as I do." The words landed with surgical precision, arrogant, dismissive, dripping with the authority of a Harvard professor who once advised presidents and defended celebrities. The anchors shifted uncomfortably. One even tried to interject, but Dershowitz raised a hand ever so slightly, claiming the space as his own. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, a slow smile forming at the edge of her lips. It was the kind of smile that said, "I've been here before. I've seen this playbook, and I know exactly how to turn it against you." The air in the studio thickened. Viewers at home sat forward, sensing the moment about to unfold. This wasn't just a debate. This wasn't just a clash of credentials. It was a collision of worlds. The old guard of elite prestige against the lived truth of a woman who had fought her way into the halls of power. Dershowitz adjusted his glasses, clearly expecting a flustered reaction. But Crockett's silence stretched on, commanding attention in a way words alone never could. The camera zoomed in on her face, calm, steady, unshaken. A hush fell over the studio. The anchors froze, their scripts useless now. The control room, the live chat, the audience at home, everyone was waiting, suspended in that unbearable pause. And then she leaned forward, eyes locked on him, her voice cool, measured, impossible to ignore. What she said next would not just silence the room, it would set the internet on fire. The clip of Dershowitz's interruption was already being clipped and replayed across timelines. But inside the studio, the moment was still raw. The stakes had shifted. What looked at first like another routine TV debate had now become something larger, a duel over credibility, dignity, and the right to be heard. To the casual viewer, this might have looked like one more talking head clash. But anyone who had followed Jasmine Crockett's career understood instantly. This was no small insult. Dershowitz wasn't just questioning her argument. He was questioning her existence in the conversation. His words carried decades of elitist undertones. Harvard over hustle, prestige over service, ivory tower over real life. And that's what made this debate matter. Because Crockett wasn't just sitting there as a politician. She was sitting there as the embodiment of the underdog, the young black congresswoman who had clawed her way through law school, community defense, and a tough political climb, now staring down a man who had been canonized by the establishment. Millions of viewers felt the imbalance immediately. On one side, the aging legal legend with shelves of books written about him, awards from elite institutions, and a resume stretching back to the Kennedy years. On the other, a freshman congresswoman, painted by critics as too bold, too new, too unrefined. It wasn't simply a clash of ideas. It was a clash of narratives. Dershowitz leaned hard on his prestige, the Harvard chair, the high-profile clients, the lectures across the globe. Every word he spoke was designed to shrink Crockett down, to remind the audience that she wasn't supposed to belong on the same stage. But Crockett didn't bite. She didn't rush to match prestige with prestige. Instead, she let him puff himself up, knowing the audience was watching the imbalance grow clearer by the second. The more he leaned on arrogance, the more he framed himself as the bully, and her as the calm, grounded alternative. Outside the studio, the perception was electric. Social media lit up. Why is Dershowitz talking down to her like that? This feels uncomfortable. He's underestimating her big mistake. The hashtags weren't trending yet, but the seeds were planted. People were already choosing sides. Because what was happening wasn't just about one congresswoman against one professor. It was about what credibility really means. Is it inherited from institutions or earned through service? Is it defined by who you know or by who you stand up for? By the time the segment hit its midpoint, the tension had outgrown the studio walls. People in coffee shops, offices, and living rooms across the country leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something was about to snap. Millions tuned in, not knowing they'd witness a career-defining moment. Before the showdown could truly land, viewers needed to understand why Alan Dershowitz's words carried such weight, and why his downfall in this debate would feel so seismic. Alan Dershowitz was not just another pundit. He was, for decades, the legal mind of the American establishment. From the moment he became the youngest full professor in Harvard Law's history, his legend grew. He defended celebrity clients, shaped national conversations, and made himself a household name. O.J. Simpson, Klaus von Bülow, Mike Tyson. His roster of clients read like a tabloid's greatest hits, and every time Dershowitz appeared, cameras followed. He thrived in controversy, branding himself as both the defender of civil liberties and the lawyer who would take the cases others wouldn't touch. But brilliance has a shadow, and for Dershowitz, that shadow was arrogance. Colleagues often whispered about his condescending tone, his eagerness to dismiss opposing voices as uninformed or unqualified. On television, he perfected the art of the sneer, a smirk that seemed to say, "I've forgotten more law than you'll ever know." That reputation didn't happen by accident. Over the years, Dershowitz cultivated it. He relished the role of the intellectual giant in the room, the one who could flatten opponents with a single citation or anecdote from the Supreme Court. For decades, it worked. Few dared challenge him directly. Even fewer won. But arrogance carries risk. And the longer he basked in his aura of untouchability, the more viewers grew weary. To many, Dershowitz became less a champion of justice and more a symbol of elitism, the old guard clinging to power, dismissing new voices with a wave of the hand. That's why his clash with Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another debate. It was a reckoning. The audience didn't need Crockett to rattle off legal citations to feel the imbalance. They had seen this pattern before. Dershowitz talking down to women, to younger professionals, to people outside the Ivy League bubble. They had seen him wield his Harvard credentials like a weapon, and this time, they weren't rooting for the giant. Emotional triggers bubbled beneath the surface. For anyone who had ever been told they weren't qualified enough, experienced enough, polished enough, Dershowitz became the stand-in for every gatekeeper they had ever faced. The irony? In his attempt to dismiss Crockett, Dershowitz only amplified her stature. His sneer painted him as the villain, and her calm smile cast her as the resilient underdog. And in storytelling, villains rarely realize they're walking into their own undoing. The tension grew heavier when commentators began adding their own spin. Some conservative outlets framed Dershowitz as the voice of hard truth, the experienced lawyer putting a young congresswoman in her place. But on social media, that framing backfired. The clips were stripped of context, shared raw, and the visual told a different story. An older white male professor smirking at a young black congresswoman, dismissing her intelligence on live TV. The optics were devastating. And that's when the cliffhanger set in. But Dershowitz was about to discover that prestige doesn't always win the room. If Alan Dershowitz represented pedigree, prestige, and the ivory tower, Jasmine Crockett represented something far more visceral: grit, resilience, and the lived struggle of ordinary Americans. Her story did not begin in the marble halls of Harvard, nor in the gilded corridors of Washington. It began in Dallas, Texas, in neighborhoods where working-class families carried more than their share of burdens. Crockett's upbringing wasn't cushioned by privilege. She understood early on what it meant to stretch a paycheck, to see neighbors work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, to watch systems built to protect people often fail them instead. It was that environment that planted the seed of justice within her. Law wasn't some abstract academic pursuit for Crockett. It was survival. It was dignity. It was the only weapon everyday people had when the odds were stacked against them. When she entered law school, Crockett didn't walk in with the arrogance of entitlement. She walked in with a notebook full of determination and a heart that beat for service. She wasn't there to impress professors with obscure citations. She was there to arm herself with the tools to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And unlike many of her classmates, Crockett had no legacy cushion, no elite family connections. Every late night she studied, every exam she passed, was carved out of sheer willpower. After graduation, she didn't chase the corner office in a skyscraper. She went where the cases were toughest, defending clients who couldn't afford proper representation.